I'm Trish from Dr. Derecki's Honors Psychology class, and I'll be teaching you all about neurons today. Let's start with the basic anatomy of a neuron. These petals here are receptors, and the branches connected to them are dendrites. The black bowl you see here is the cell body and nucleus. Attached to the cell body is the axon, which is made up of the hillock, nodes of Ranvier, and the terminal branch, which is also the little skeleton hand. The area between the skeleton hand and the flowers, aka the dendrites of the second neuron, right here, is the synaptic gap. Right now you're probably thinking, what are those? Don't worry, we'll go more in depth. Let's zoom in on the dendrites. Step 1, initiation and transduction. Here's how it all begins. The little jewel here, or the neurotransmitter, is so captivated by the beauty of the dendrites receptors that it goes over to the receptors and hits on them. While the neurotransmitter is hitting on the receptors, the channels within the membrane of the dendrite produce electricity. But how? Step 2, transduction. Once again. On the inside of the cell, we have a bunch of positively charged potassium ions and one negatively charged protein ion. So on the outside, we have a bunch of positively charged sodium ions and a negatively charged chlorine ion. But here's the thing. The sodium and potassium ions can move through these doors on the membrane called channels, but the protein and chlorine ions stay put. Let's talk about resting potential. Alright, let's zoom in on resting. There we go. This is when the cell is just chilling. During this stage, this inside of the cell is negative 70 millivolts. This charge causes the potassium channel to open, which then allows a few potassium ions to diffuse from the inside of the cell to the outside. Moving on to the next panel. After the potassium channel closes, the sodium channel opens. During this stage of action potential, the positive sodium ions on the outside develop a huge crush on the negative protein ion inside. This is not only called diffusion, this attraction is also ionic force. This influx of sodium ions causes the inside of the cell to go from negative 70 millivolts to a positive 40 millivolts, which makes a little spark. Here we go. This little spark shows that the inside of the cell is firing. Now we have refractory period number 1. This is where the cell tries to chill out from being so fired up. So the cell has no chill, and it's trying to go back to being relaxed. The potassium channel opens once again, so to the benefit of the potassium ions inside the cell. These little guys are so tired of protein that they desperately want to go back to their true love, chlorine. So diffusion and ionic force are added again. As a result, the inside of the cell returns to negative 70 millivolts. We're not entirely done yet. Bummer, I know. We have yet another refractory period. But this time, the cell finally reaches maximum chill. So in refractory period number 1, the order of the positively charged ions got completely reversed. All the potassium ions moved to the outside, and all the sodium ions moved to the inside. Refractory period number 2 restores everything back to normal. You'll notice here that both channels are closed, so you might be a little confused as to how the ions transfer to their original spots. See this little eyeball that I've been ignoring until now? That's the sodium-potassium pump. This dude right here swaps sodium and potassium ions out until they're all in their respectful places. The inside of this cell is negative 70 millivolts, and everything is where it needs to be. Hoorah! Steps 3 and 4, propagation and firing. We just learned about the negative 70, 40, and negative 70 voltage pattern that happens within the dendrites, but did you know that it also passes on to the cell body, into the hillock? The cell body and hillock are very nosy and wanted in on all the fun. After the volt passes on to the hillock, it asks itself, should I fire or nah? If the hillock is charged at negative 55 millivolts, which is the threshold that'll make or break the firing process, it'll fire. Step 5, saltatory conduction. This is what happens if the hillock decides to fire. The nodes of Ranvier have a ton of sodium ions and channels, right? When the hillock fires, the sodium channels within a node open and the sodium ions around the node swarm through these channels, entering it. But the sodium ions do this because they're still crazy about protein. Remember, ionic force. And guess what? The myelin sheath, which acts like a warm blanket for the nodes of Ranvier, are full of it. So, the sodium ions rush into the myelin sheath to be with the protein ions. The whole process repeats itself within the next node. Before we continue, I have to tell you something. During this process, the electric signal seems to skip and jump between each node as if it were a game of hopscotch. This happens because A, all nodes must receive electricity, and B, the sodium ions that flow into the nodes and the myelin sheets that cover them must be recharged. Step 6, transduction. Again. We're almost done though. Alright, we started out with the chemical reaction during the initiation period and went through an electrical one for a while. Now we're back to chemical. Remember the neurotransmitters we talked about way earlier? They're back. Since the electrical surge we've been talking about this whole time passed through the nodes of Ranvier and myelin sheets, they're now about to pass through the end of the axon, or the vesicles of the terminal branch. In this case, the vesicles are the joints of the skeleton fingers. So, for starters, the voltage within the vesicle is 40 millivolts once again. Here's where the neurotransmitters come in. The neurotransmitters travel through the vesicle and enter the synaptic gap. Here's the grand finale, aka the end. The neurotransmitter can now do 4 things. Rebirth. It can fall in love with the dendrite receptors of another neuron and trigger the whole process we've covered all over again. Game over. The neurotransmitter can be shut down by an autoreceptor. The 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and recycle. The neurotransmitter is recycled back into the vesicle of the terminal branch by this thing called the reuptake channel. Or death. Dun dun dun. The neurotransmitter is destroyed by enzymes. Game over. 3 R's and death are there to conserve energy. So, the job is done and the axon is cleared.